I want the fat girl. Mountain Man pointed at the obese Chinese girl selling for $1. A dusty spring wind whips through the freight platform as the crowd jeers. One by one, the laborers are sold, until a young Chinese woman in a gaudy, ill-fitting dress is dragged forward. The auctioneer laughs. $1! The crowd roars, until a broad-shouldered mountain man steps from the shadows. His voice cuts the air. I want the fat girl. Gasps. Coins clink. But this is no purchase. This is a rescue. What follows will pit them against the town's most powerful man, a poisoned water spring, and a law twisted to keep her in chains. She holds proof that could topple them all, but only if she survives long enough to speak. In a place where greed rules and the truth burns like gunpowder, will one defiant stand be enough to set her free, or will the frontier swallow her whole? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The dry spring afternoon hung heavy over Eden Spur's freight platform. Dust devils swirled between the weathered planks as townsfolk gathered for what Eustace Bell called his labor auction. The railroad paymaster stood tall in his pressed suit, a ledger tucked under one arm, while weary workers shuffled forward one by one. The crowd pressed close, their boots scuffing against wood worn smooth by years of freight traffic. The air smelled of coal smoke from the distant railroad yard, mixed with the sharp bite of unwashed bodies and desperation. One by one, Bell called forth the laborers, mostly Chinese workers who'd helped lay track through the territory, now caught in a web of company debt. Next up, Bell announced, his voice carrying across the platform with practiced authority. He seized Lin May's arm and hauled her forward. The young woman stumbled slightly but kept her chin high, even as snickers rippled through the crowd. She wore a garish dress that hung wrong on her plus-sized frame, clearly chosen to mock rather than clothe her with dignity. The fabric was cheap calico in clashing colors, tight in all the wrong places. Here's a fine specimen, Bell drawled, his cultured accent doing nothing to mask the cruelty in his words. Skilled with a needle, reads and writes both English and Chinese. Might even keep your books, if you're of a mind to trust her figures. He yanked Lin May's arm, making her turn in a circle like livestock at auction. Jeers erupted from the crowd. Someone called out something crude about her size. Lin May's face remained carefully blank, but her hands trembled slightly where they were clasped before her. Starting bid is $1, Bell announced. Surely someone needs a seamstress, or perhaps just someone to keep your cabin tidy. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he surveyed the crowd. A moment of tense silence fell. Then heavy boots thudded against the platform steps. The crowd parted as Jonah Pike stepped forward, his buckskins dusty from the trail. The mountain man's broad shoulders and weathered face drew all eyes, though his expression remained neutral. I want the fat girl, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. $1. Gasps rippled through the gathering. Lin May's carefully maintained composure cracked for just a moment, pain flashing across her features at the blunt words. But Jonah wasn't finished. He drew a silver dollar from his pocket and laid it deliberately on Bell's ledger. She ain't for sale after this, he continued, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent platform. She's under my protection until a proper judge can sort this mess out. His hand dropped casually to rest near the knife at his belt. Not a threat, but a reminder that he wasn't a man to be trifled with. Before Bell could respond, the clear tone of the church bell rang out across Main Street. Heads turned toward the whitewashed Methodist church where Reverend Abigail Hart stood in the doorway, her gray hair neat beneath her bonnet despite the wind. This church offers sanctuary to any worker held against their will, she called out, her voice strong and sure. The Lord's house stands open to all who seek shelter from injustice. Bell's face darkened with anger, but he kept his smooth manner. Now, Reverend, surely you understand these are simply business arrangements. I understand that the Lord calls us to mercy and justice, Hart cut him off firmly. And I understand that holding people in bondage through manipulated debt is neither merciful nor just. Jonah stepped closer to Lin May, his presence solid and reassuring. Ma'am, he said quietly, would you care to accept the Reverend's hospitality? He didn't touch her, but positioned himself between her and Bell. Lin May straightened her shoulders, dignity wrapped around her like armor. Yes, she said softly but clearly. I would. The crowd parted again as Jonah escorted her down the platform steps. Their boots kicked up small clouds of dust as they crossed Main Street to the church. Behind them, Bell's voice rose in protest, but the continued tolling of the church bell drowned him out. Inside the church hall, the afternoon light filtered through simple glass windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Reverend Hart bustled about, setting out cups of fresh tea on a scarred table. Sit, please, she urged them, pulling out chairs. You're safe here. Lin Mei sank carefully onto a straight-backed chair, her hands still trembling slightly as she smoothed the gaudy skirt. Jonah remained standing, his bulk between her and the door as if expecting trouble to follow. I reckon I owe you an apology, ma'am, he said after a moment, his voice gruff but sincere. The way I spoke out there, it wasn't right. I meant to help, but my words were clumsy. Lin Mei's eyes studied him carefully over the rim of her teacup. Why did you intervene? She asked finally. Jonah shifted his weight, uncomfortable with explaining himself. Ain't right what Bell's doing. Turning people into property through bookkeeping tricks. Been watching him work his schemes since he came to town. He paused, choosing his words with care. My pa taught me that a man's word should be his bond, fair and square. What Bell does, it ain't square. Many watch, few act, Lin Mei observed quietly. Reverend Hart settled into a chair between them, her presence calm and steadying. The Lord often works through unexpected vessels, she said. Sometimes it takes one person willing to stand up first, to give others the courage to do what's right. Outside, shadows lengthened across Main Street as the sun sank toward the western hills. The crowd had begun to disperse, though a few lingered, discussing the afternoon's events in low voices. Bell could be seen through the window, gathering his ledgers with sharp, angry movements. Inside the church hall, Lin Mei's hands had steadied around her teacup. Her face remained guarded, but some of the tension had eased from her shoulders. The sanctuary offered by both Reverend Hart and the gruff mountain man might be temporary, but it was real. Jonah moved to the window, checking the street with the instincts of a man used to watching his back. Reckon Bell won't let this rest easy, he said quietly. No, Hart agreed, but neither shall we. The Lord calls us to stand firm against injustice. She reached across the table to pat Lin Mei's hand. You're not alone anymore, child. Lin Mei's eyes glistened briefly before she blinked the tears away. Thank you, she whispered, including both Hart and Jonah in her glance. The afternoon light continued to fade, casting longer shadows through the windows. The church bell had fallen silent, but its echo seemed to linger in the air, a reminder that sometimes a single action, like Jonah's startling bid, could draw a line that changed everything. The simple church hall had become a sanctuary, not just of safety, but of dignity restored and humanity affirmed. Reverend Hart rose to light the oil lamps as dusk approached. Their warm glow pushed back the gathering shadows, creating a pool of light around the table where they sat. The lamplight caught the tears of gratitude Lin Mei couldn't quite hide, and the determined set of Jonah's jaw as he maintained his protective vigil. Outside, Eden Spur settled into evening, the town transformed by the afternoon's events. Bell's casual display of power had been challenged, not by violence or grand gestures, but by one man's gruff compassion and a preacher's unwavering faith. The line had been drawn, clear as the lengthening shadows across Main Street, a line between what was legal and what was right, between submission and dignity, between standing aside and standing up. Evening shadows deepened outside the church windows as Reverend Hart trimmed the oil lamps, their warm glow casting a gentle light through the hall. Lin Mei sat at the scarred wooden table, her hands folded in her lap, while Jonah kept his post near the door watching the street through the gathering dusk. Perhaps some more tea? Reverend Hart offered, but Lin Mei shook her head. There is something I must show you, she said quietly. Rising from her chair, she retrieved a small bundle wrapped in worn leather from where she'd set it earlier. The leather was cracked with age and travel, tied with a simple cord. Her fingers trembled slightly as she untied the knot. This belonged to my uncle, she explained, her voice soft but clear. He was the railroad's tallyman before. She paused, gathering herself. Before the mine collapse. Jonah moved closer, his boots making the floorboards creak. The bundle, when opened, revealed a ledger bound in faded blue cloth. Lin Mei handled it with reverence, carefully opening the cover to expose pages dense with neat columns of figures. What caught the eye was how each entry appeared twice, once in flowing Chinese characters, and again in precise English below. My uncle taught me both languages and his bookkeeping methods, Lin Mei continued. Her finger traced down one column, then its partner. Here. See how the wage amounts differ? In Chinese, the true amounts promised to workers. In English, what Bell's office actually paid. Reverend Hart leaned in, adjusting her spectacles. The difference is significant, she noted, her voice tight with controlled anger. 10% here, 15% there, Lin Mei confirmed. Small enough to seem like calculation errors if questioned, but it adds up, week after week, month after month. When workers protest, Bell shows them signed contracts with even lower amounts. Jonah's weathered face darkened. Keeping folks trapped with manufactured debt, he growled. Been seeing men work themselves to bone trying to clear what they're told they owe. As Lin Mei turned another page, something slipped from between the leaves, a folded paper, worn at the creases. She opened it carefully, revealing a hand-drawn map. The paper was yellowed with age, but the ink lines remained clear, showing familiar landmarks around Eden Spur. Near the center, neat Chinese characters were accompanied by flowing script in another language. My uncle marked this, Lin Mei explained. He said it was important, but died before telling me why. The Chinese notes mention water rights, but I cannot read the other writing. A sharp knock at the door made them all start. Jonah's hand dropped to his knife, but Reverend Hart moved calmly to answer it. She opened the door to reveal a tall figure in the gathering darkness, Running Bear, his dark eyes taking in the scene before him. Brother, Jonah greeted him, relaxing. Didn't expect you in town. Running Bear stepped inside, nodding respectfully to the others. The wind carries news, he said simply. I heard of today's events. His gaze fell on the map spread across the table, and something flickered in his expression. You know these markings? Lin Mei asked, noting his interest. Shoshone, he confirmed, moving closer. This spring has many names, but we call it Promise Water. His finger traced the characters. Our elders made an agreement long ago. The water would flow free for all, if the labor of those who used it remained free also. Jonah straightened. That new barbed wire I saw up there last week. Bell's men, Running Bear nodded. They build fences, post guards. Just like he tries to fence in people, Reverend Hart observed quietly, using debt instead of wire. Lin Mei's fingers traced the edge of her uncle's ledger. The timing fits. As Bell began restricting water access, the wage discrepancies grew larger. My uncle was gathering proof, I think. Then the mine. Her voice caught. Accidents happen mighty convenient sometimes, Jonah said grimly. Especially when someone's asking difficult questions. The lamplight cast their shadows long against the walls as they studied the documents spread before them. The ledger's columns of figures told one story of bondage, while the map suggested another layer to Bell's schemes. Control of both water and workers, each reinforcing the other. Bell will guard his claim jealously, Reverend Hart warned. Both the spring and his hold over the men. He has the law's ear and the railroad's backing. But not truth's backing, Lin Mei said firmly. My uncle died seeking justice. I cannot do less. Running Bear studied her with quiet approval. The spring's promise was meant to prevent such bondage, he said. Your uncle understood this. The church bell tolled the late hour, making them all aware of the darkness outside. Reverend Hart straightened, practical concerns taking precedence. You'll stay here tonight, she said to Lin Mei. The loft is small but clean. There's a pallet and blankets. Lin Mei nodded, gathering the ledger and map with careful hands. Thank you. It would not be proper to stay elsewhere. A faint blush colored her cheeks as she glanced briefly at Jonah. I'll keep watch, Jonah said gruffly, understanding her meaning. Running Bear? The Shoshone scout nodded. I will stay also. There is more to discuss. Outside in the darkness, a figure stood motionless in the shadows across the street. Sheriff Cade watched the warm lamplight spilling from the church windows, noted the silhouettes moving within. His hand rested on his gun belt as he considered his options. Finally, with a shake of his head, he turned and walked away, boots scraping softly in the dirt. Inside, Lin May climbed the narrow stairs to the loft carrying a lamp Reverend Hart had given her. The ledger and map were clutched protectively to her chest. Below, she could hear the low murmur of voices as the others continued their discussion. The simple pallet looked welcoming after the day's ordeals, but her mind was too full for sleep. She sat cross-legged on the blankets, opened the ledger once more, and began to read, seeking answers in her uncle's careful columns of figures, trying to understand what he had died protecting. The lamp's small flame cast her shadow against the rough wooden walls as she worked, a solitary figure keeping vigil with the dead man's records, while others kept watch below. Morning sunlight streamed through the church's high windows, painting golden squares across the worn wooden floor. The air held the lingering scent of coffee brewing on Reverend Hart's small stove, mixed with the mustier smell of old hymnals and well-oiled pews. Lin May sat at the same table where they'd examined the ledger the night before, now cleared except for a steaming cup and a plate with a half-eaten biscuit. She'd changed back into her own clothes, a simple blue cotton dress with careful mending, and her hair was neatly braided. The gaudy auction dress lay forgotten in a corner, a reminder of yesterday's humiliation. Jonah lounged against the wall near the door, his own coffee cup balanced on the window ledge. He'd spent the night in the church's front pew, rifle across his knees. Running Bear had disappeared before dawn, saying only that he would return. More coffee? Reverend Hart offered, making her morning rounds with the pot. The preacher looked fresh despite the early hour, her gray hair neat under her cap, her movements brisk and purposeful. Before anyone could answer, boot steps sounded on the church steps. Jonah straightened, hand dropping to his belt, but it was Sheriff Cade who appeared in the doorway. The morning light caught the star on his chest, making it gleam. Reverend, Pike. Cade's voice was flat as he nodded to each in turn. His eyes settled on Lin May, who met his gaze steadily. Miss Lin? Sheriff. Reverend Hart's tone remained pleasant as she set down her coffee pot. Would you care for a cup? No, ma'am, this ain't a social call. Cade stepped fully inside, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. Come to give fair warning. What you're doing here, harboring a contracted laborer, it's against the law. There was no valid contract, Jonah growled. That auction was nothing but... Cade held up a hand. Save your arguments for the judge. Bell's got papers showing Miss Lin agreed to work off her uncle's debts. Territory law's clear on such matters. Clear as mud, Reverend Hart said crisply. And just as dirty. Those contracts were signed under duress, if they exist at all. That's for the court to decide. Cade's face remained impassive. I'm giving you 3 days. Hand Miss Lin over peaceful-like, or I'll have to take her into custody. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Lin May's hands tightened around her coffee cup, but her voice was steady. My uncle kept records. True records. They will show... 3 days, Cade repeated, already turning toward the door. I've got no stomach for seeing folk hurt, but I will do my duty. He paused in the doorway, not quite looking back. Bell's men ain't as particular about being gentle. Best remember that. The door closed behind him with a solid thunk. Through the window, they watched him cross the street, dust rising under his boots. 3 days, Reverend Hart mused, picking up her coffee pot again. Well, the Lord can do quite a lot in 3 days, as I recall. Jonah snorted, but some of the tension eased from his shoulders. Reckon we'd best get to work then. They gathered around the table where Lin May spread out her uncle's ledger once more. Running Bear appeared silently in the doorway, as if summoned by their purpose. He carried a small bundle of herbs, their sharp scent cutting through the coffee smell. The spring? Jonah asked. Running Bear nodded, setting his bundle aside. 4 men guard it. New fence stretches half a mile. They're damming the flow, directing it to Bell's holdings. If we can prove the old agreement... Lin May's fingers traced the columns of figures before her. My uncle marked entries about water usage, timing of fence building, wages withheld. It will take time to translate fully, but time we ain't got much of, Jonah reminded her. I will scout more, Running Bear offered. There may be other ways to the spring, the old paths my people used. Carefully, Reverend Hart cautioned. Bell's men will be watching for interest in that area now. The morning wore on. Lin Mei bent over the ledger, muttering softly in Chinese as she worked. Jonah paced between windows, checking the street. Running Bear sat cross-legged in a corner, methodically sorting his herbs while his dark eyes missed nothing. Reverend Hart moved between them all like a quiet breeze, refilling cups, offering encouragement. Near midday, the door burst open with a bang. Rosie Pike stood framed in the entrance, her face flushed with what looked like righteous anger. She wore a neat brown dress suitable for teaching, and her hair was pinned severely back. "Jonah Pike," she declared. "What in heaven's name do you think you're—" Her voice trailed off as she took in the scene before her. Lin Mei had looked up at the interruption. A small boy, one of Rosie's students, stood beside her chair, holding still while she carefully mended a tear in his sleeve. Her needle flashed in the sunlight as she made tiny, even stitches. "Thank you, Miss Lin," the boy said shyly as she tied off her thread. "Ma ain't had time to fix it, and teacher said it wasn't proper for school." "You're welcome, Tommy," Lin Mei smiled, smoothing the mended sleeve. "Now run along to your lessons." The boy scampered past Rosie, who watched him go with an expression of bewilderment. When she turned back, some of the fire had gone out of her stance. "Well," she said less forcefully, "I see you've been busy, Uncle Jonah." "Sit down, Rosie," Jonah suggested mildly. "Have some coffee." Rosie allowed Reverend Hart to guide her to a chair, though her back remained straight as a ruler. "The whole town's talking," she reported, accepting a cup. "Bell's men were in the saloon all night, making threats. And now I hear the sheriff's involved." "We know," Jonah said simply. "It's dangerous," Rosie persisted. "You can't just—" She stopped, watching Lin Mei return to her careful translation work. "What are you doing?" "Seeking truth," Lin Mei answered without looking up. "My uncle died for it. I think he would want me to finish his work." Rosie's expression softened further. She sipped her coffee, studying the neat columns of figures. "You write a fine hand," she observed, "in both languages." "My uncle taught me." A shadow crossed Lin Mei's face. He said knowledge was the only thing that couldn't be taken away. "Smart man," Rosie said quietly. She set down her cup with a decisive click. "Well, I suppose I'd better tell you what else I've heard." The day crept toward evening. Reverend Hart had to leave for a time to conduct a wedding, but she returned with bread and stew from the bride's feast. They ate together as the sun sank, sharing what they'd learned. After supper, Jonah stepped out onto the church steps to smoke his evening pipe. The air had cooled, carrying the scent of sage from the hills. Lamplight spilled from the church windows behind him, and when he glanced back he could see Lin Mei still at her work, head bent over the ledger while Rosie sat beside her, asking quiet questions. Running Bear materialized from the shadows to sit beside him. Neither man spoke for a time, sharing the peaceful moment. But they both felt it, in the breeze, in the town's watchful silence, in the very air around them. Something was coming. The peaceful evening was just a pause, a deep breath before whatever storm approached. Jonah tapped out his pipe, the soft sound loud in the stillness. Inside, Lin Mei turned another page, her shadow moving across the golden lamplight. 3 days. Not much time to prevent a range war over water, save a woman's freedom and find justice for a dead man's courage. But they'd done harder things, him and Running Bear, and they'd never had cause like this before. The church bell tolled the hour, its deep notes rolling out across the darkening town. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered with its lonely song. Jonah looked down at his empty pipe, then up at the first stars appearing in the purple sky. 3 days. They'd make them count. Gray light crept over the eastern horizon as Running Bear mounted his paint horse. The pre-dawn air held a bite, and his breath made small clouds in the chill. He adjusted the medicine pouch at his belt, a habit born of years tracking through dangerous territory. Jonah stood beside the horse, one hand on its warm flank. "Watch yourself," he said quietly. "Bell's men won't take kindly to anyone poking around their new claim." Running Bear nodded, his dark eyes scanning the sleeping town. "I will be as the morning mist," he said. "They will not see me come or go." He touched his heels to the horse's sides, and they moved off silently, blending with the shadows that still clung to the streets. Jonah watched until horse and rider disappeared into the pearl-gray distance, then turned back to the church. Inside, Lin Mei was already awake, bent over her uncle's ledger in the early light. She'd tied her hair back with a faded ribbon, and her fingers were stained with ink. "You should rest more," Jonah said, pouring them both coffee from the pot warming on the small stove. Lin Mei shook her head without looking up. "There is too much work," she said. "Each page I translate shows more tricks in the numbers. See here?" She pointed to a column of figures. The same amount taken from many workers' pay, listed as water fees in English, but in Chinese it says protection money. Jonah's weathered face darkened. "Sounds about right for Bell's way of doing business." The morning grew brighter. Reverend Hart arrived with fresh bread and preserves, the scent of baking still clinging to her shawl. They ate a quick breakfast. Then Jonah pulled on his coat. "Need to see about supplies," he explained. "Tom Wheeler at the Mercantile's been friendly to me since I helped his boy with a lame horse last winter. Might have news worth hearing, too." The bell over Wheeler's door jingled as Jonah entered. Morning sunlight slanted through dusty windows, catching the gleam of brass scales and glass jars. Tom Wheeler looked up from his ledger, his round face creased with worry. "Jonah," he said quietly, glancing toward the back of the store. "Wasn't sure I'd be seeing you." "Need some supplies," Jonah said casually, moving between the shelves. "Coffee. Bacon. Might be traveling soon." Wheeler followed, speaking low. "Bell was in here first thing, making threats about anyone helping that Chinese girl or crossing his water rights." He paused, checking the empty store again. "Said his patience was done, talking about bringing in more men from the railroad camps." Jonah nodded, selecting items with careful deliberation. "Appreciate the warning, Tom. How much for the coffee?" "On the house," Wheeler said firmly. "Just be careful, Jonah. Bell ain't the type to let go of what he thinks is his." Back at the church, Lin Mei had cleared space on the table, papers spread out in neat rows. Her brush moved steadily, copying columns of figures onto fresh sheets. The morning light caught the ink's wet sheen as she worked. "Your writing is very beautiful," Reverend Hart observed, watching the careful strokes. Lin Mei's cheeks colored slightly. "My uncle insisted I learn both styles properly. He said—" Her voice caught for a moment. "He said truth should be recorded with respect, no matter the language it's written in." The sun climbed higher, shadows shortening on the church floor. Jonah paced between windows, checking the street. Around midday, Running Bear's paint horse appeared at the edge of town, moving at an easy walk that wouldn't draw attention. Running Bear dismounted in the church's shadow, dust coating his clothes and face. His expression was grave as he accepted a cup of water from Reverend Hart. "They have fenced the spring," he reported once they'd gathered close. "New posts and wire stretch half a mile along the creek. They've dug a deep ditch, turning the water toward the railroad tanks." He drew a rough map in the dust on the floor. 4 men guard it now. More signs of camp building. They mean to stay." "That spring was promised free," Jonah growled, "to everyone. Your people knew it first." Running Bear nodded. "The old ones remember the agreement. Water is life. It was meant to be shared, not owned." He brushed away the dust-drawn map. "But Bell's men carry rifles, and they do not listen to old promises." Lin Mei looked up from her work, determination in her eyes. "Then we must make them listen to the law instead. My uncle's records show the original water rights, and how Bell changed them through fraud. If we can prove it." The afternoon wore on. Lin Mei's careful brushstrokes filled page after page, recording in both languages the evidence of Bell's schemes. Jonah helped Running Bear tend to his horse, then checked their supplies again. Reverend Hart moved between them all, offering encouragement and practical help in equal measure. As the sun began to set, Bootsteps sounded on the church steps. Rosie Pike entered, carrying a covered pot that filled the air with the rich smell of beef stew. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, setting it down. Her voice was careful, but softer than the day before, and I might have heard some things at school today worth knowing. They gathered around the table, bowls of steaming stew before them. Rosie spoke between bites, sharing what she'd learned from her students, whose parents worked for Bell, which families had lost water rights where tension was building highest. "The widow Collins said Bell's men came yesterday," she reported. "Told her she'd have to pay double for water now since she was uncooperative about selling her place." "He's squeezing everyone," Jonah said grimly, "using the water to control the whole valley." Lin May pushed her empty bowl aside, pulling her papers closer. "These records show it clearly now. The pattern of fraud, the threats, the stolen wages." She looked up at them. "But will it be enough?" "Judge Harrison holds court in the county seat," Reverend Hart said thoughtfully. "He's known for being fair-minded, even in cases involving Chinese workers. If we could get these records to him—" "It's 2 days' ride to Sweetwater," Jonah calculated. "Through Bell's territory." "My wagon is sound," Reverend Hart offered. "I'm expected to make my circuit round soon anyway. No one would question me traveling with a few companions." They looked at each other across the table, weighing the risks. Outside, the wind had risen, rattling the church's shutters with ghostly fingers. "We'd need to leave soon," Jonah said finally, "before Bell brings in more men." Lin May's fingers traced her uncle's signature in the ledger. "I will go," she said firmly. "These are my uncle's records. I must speak for his truth." Rosie stood, smoothing her skirts. "I should get back to the schoolhouse," she said. "But—" She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "I can help. I know which families might shelter you along the way. Let me make some inquiries." After night fell, Jonah moved quietly through the church, gathering what they'd need: bedrolls, food, ammunition for his rifle. The wind continued to rise, making the lamplight dance as he worked. Running Bear appeared silently beside him, helping to load supplies into Reverend Hart's wagon, which waited in the church's shadow. They worked with the easy coordination of long partnership, securing everything carefully. "The wind brings change," Running Bear observed, testing a rope's tension. "Good or ill remains to be seen." Jonah grunted agreement, checking the wagon's wheels. The night pressed close around them, full of whispers and shifting shadows. Somewhere in town, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Inside, Lin May was still at work, copying the last crucial pages by lamplight. Her shadow moved across the church windows as she wrote, steady and determined. The wind rattled the shutters again, harder this time, but she didn't look up from her task. The evidence was gathered. The wagon was loaded. Tomorrow they would begin their journey to seek justice. But for now, the night wind moaned around the church corners, and they each prepared in their own way for what lay ahead. The pale light of dawn crept over the eastern horizon, painting the church steeple in soft gold. Jonah stood in the cool morning air, checking the wagon's wheel hubs one final time. His experienced hands moved methodically, testing each connection and strap. "Them wheels should hold," he muttered, straightening up. The borrowed wagon wasn't new, but Reverend Hart had kept it well maintained. Its wooden sides were weathered but solid, the canvas cover patched but sturdy. Inside the church, Lin May wrapped her uncle's ledger carefully in oilcloth, securing it with twine. Her movements were precise, protecting the precious documents from any dampness they might encounter. The map she tucked safely into an inner pocket of her practical traveling dress, one Rosie had brought the night before, saying gruffly that no one should travel in clothes meant to shame them. Running Bear appeared silently from the morning shadows, leading his paint horse. He'd already scouted the immediate area around town, ensuring their departure wouldn't be observed. "The roads are soft," he reported quietly. "Spring melt has turned much to mud. We will need to choose our path carefully." Jonah nodded, helping Lin May climb onto the wagon seat. Her face was set with determination, though her hands gripped the wooden seat tightly. He couldn't blame her for being nervous. They all knew the risks they were taking. Reverend Hart emerged from the church carrying a final bundle of supplies. God go with you, he said softly, passing it up. I've marked the safest stops on your map. Friends who'll help if needed. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when they set out, moving slowly through Eden Spur's empty streets. Running Bear rode ahead, his paint horse stepping quietly through the morning mist. Jonah handled the wagon reins with careful attention, guiding the horses around the worst of the mud holes. Once they cleared the town limits, the rutted road stretched before them like a muddy ribbon, winding through sage-dotted hills. Spring had softened the usual hard-packed dirt into treacherous patches of mire. More than once, Jonah had to climb down and lead the horses carefully around particularly deep spots. As the morning wore on, the sun burned away the mist, revealing a vast Wyoming sky overhead. Lin May sat quietly beside Jonah, occasionally steadying herself against the wagon's swaying. The leather of the reins creaked rhythmically, wagon wheels turning with steady determination. I never properly thanked you, Lin May said suddenly, breaking the morning's silence. For what you did at the auction. Her voice was soft but clear, even though the words stung at first. Jonah's weathered face showed regret. Them words weren't right, he said slowly. I spoke rough, trying to stop what was happening. Should have found a better way. Lin May nodded, accepting both the apology and the explanation. Sometimes we must use the tools at hand, she said, even imperfect ones. The wagon rocked over another rut, and Lin May steadied herself before continuing. I came to Wyoming 3 years ago, she shared, her voice carrying over the wagon's creaking. My uncle wrote that he needed help with his records, someone who could work with both languages. She described the long journey from Guangdong province, across an ocean and then half a continent. Her uncle had been waiting at the railroad station, thin but smiling, proud to show her the small office where he kept the railroad's books. He taught me everything about the work, she said, her voice growing softer. How to track the hours, calculate the wages, keep everything clear and honest. He said truth in numbers was sacred. It showed how much each person's work mattered. The sun climbed higher as she spoke of the mine disaster, how the support beams had given way without warning, how her uncle had died trying to help others escape. Her words painted a picture of chaos and loss, of promises broken in the aftermath. Jonah listened quietly, letting her story unfold at its own pace. The wagon swayed beneath them, wheels turning steadily through the spring mud. Ahead, Running Bear's paint horse picked its way carefully along the trail's firmer edges. Near midday, they stopped briefly to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch of bread and dried beef. Running Bear rejoined them, reporting no signs of pursuit so far. The afternoon stretched ahead as they continued their journey, the wagon's shadow growing longer across the rutted road. The sun was sinking toward the western hills when Running Bear led them off the main trail toward a small line shack tucked against a rocky outcrop. The simple wooden structure was weathered but solid, offering shelter for the night. Used to stop here sometimes during my trapping days, Jonah explained as he unhitched the horses. Good spring nearby and the roof don't leak much. While Jonah tended to the horses, Lin May and Running Bear gathered wood for a small fire. Soon, a pot of beans was simmering over the flames, the familiar smell mixing with sage smoke in the evening air. They sat close to the fire's warmth as darkness gathered. The horses nickered softly from where they were picketed, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote called. Running Bear stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing upward. The spring you seek to protect, he said thoughtfully. My people have known it since before memory. The old ones say it was a gift from Mother Earth herself. The firelight played across his face as he spoke of his people's connection to the water, how it had never frozen, even in the coldest winters, how it had sustained all who came in peace, deer, elk, human alike, how promises had been made about keeping it free for all. Water is life, he said simply. It was meant to flow like breath, not be caught in tanks and sold like trinkets. Lin May nodded, her face serious in the flickering light. My uncle understood that too, she said. He used to say that trying to own water was like trying to own the wind. It belongs to everyone or no one. More coyotes joined the first, their songs echoing across the darkened landscape. Jonah banked the fire for the night while Lin May and Running Bear unrolled their bedding. Lin Mei inside the shack for propriety, the men outside under the stars. The night settled around them like a blanket. Through the shack's small window, Lin Mei could see the fire's dying glow, could hear the soft sounds of the horses and the continuing coyote chorus. Despite the day's difficult travel, despite the uncertainties ahead, she felt a strange peace. Outside, Jonah lay on his bedroll, studying the stars overhead. The same stars he'd watched countless nights alone in the mountains. But tonight was different. Tonight he was part of something larger than himself, a quest for justice that somehow felt right deep in his bones. Running Bear sat wrapped in his blanket, keeping first watch. His keen eyes scanned the darkness beyond their camp, alert for any sign of trouble. But his thoughts were on the spring, on promises made and broken, on the hope that truth might finally prevail. The coyotes called again, their voices rising and falling like ancient prayers in the vast Wyoming night. Inside the shack, Lin Mei clutched her uncle's ledger close, its presence a reminder of why they traveled. Outside, the horses shifted quietly, and the fire's embers glowed like earthbound stars. Trust, hard-won and fragile as morning frost, had begun to grow between them. Each had shared pieces of their story, their truth. Each had revealed the wounds that had shaped them, the hopes that drove them forward. As sleep finally claimed them one by one, the night wind whispered through sage and stone, carrying their dreams toward tomorrow. Morning light filtered through scattered clouds as they broke camp. Jonah checked the horses, while Lin Mei carefully packed away her uncle's ledger and the precious map. Running Bear scouted ahead as always, his paint horse blending with the landscape's muted spring colors. The wagon's wheels turned steadily over the rutted road, its familiar creaking a constant companion. The morning air held a hint of warmth, promising a fair day for travel. Lin Mei sat straighter on the wagon seat, her shoulders tense with anticipation. Beside her, Jonah handled the reins with practiced ease, his weathered face set in concentration. "Reckon we'll make the county seat by noon," Jonah said, gauging the sun's position. "Judge Ellsworth usually holds court till sundown." Lin Mei nodded, one hand resting protectively on the leather satchel containing the evidence. The morning hours passed slowly, marked by the steady clip-clop of hooves and the rhythmic sway of the wagon. Running Bear appeared periodically, signaling all clear before vanishing again among the hills. As the sun climbed toward its peak, buildings began to appear on the horizon. First just dark shapes against the sky, then gradually revealing themselves as proper structures, brick and clapboard rising proudly from the prairie. The county seat was smaller than Eden Spur but more distinguished, with its courthouse standing tall at the center of town. They passed a livery stable, a general store, and a milliner's shop before reaching the courthouse square. Jonah guided the wagon to a hitching post, the horses grateful for the rest. Running Bear appeared silently beside them as they climbed down, his expression alert but calm. The courthouse steps felt solid under their feet as they climbed toward the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the air was cooler, smelling of leather-bound books and wood polish. Their boots echoed on the polished floor as a clerk directed them to Judge Ellsworth's chambers. The judge was a tall man with steel-gray hair and keen eyes that seemed to look right through pretense. He sat behind a massive oak desk, listening intently as they presented their case. Lin Mei's voice remained steady as she explained the ledger's contents, showing how the columns revealed systematic wage theft. Her fingers traced the careful entries, one column in Chinese characters, the other in English, the numbers telling their damning story. Jonah spoke of the spring and the new fence, his plain words carrying the weight of long experience with the land. Running Bear added his testimony about the old agreements, speaking with quiet dignity of promises made and broken. Hours passed as Judge Ellsworth examined the evidence. He asked pointed questions, making careful notes. The afternoon light slanted through tall windows, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Finally, he set down his pen and looked at them each in turn. "The evidence is clear," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "I'm issuing an immediate injunction. The fence at the spring must be removed within 7 days. Water access will be restored to all parties, and these so-called labor auctions are suspended pending full review." He pulled out official papers, his pen scratching across the surface as he wrote out the orders. "I'll have copies sent to Sheriff Cade and Mr. Bell by tomorrow's post. The law must apply equally to all, regardless of station or circumstance. Relief washed over Lin May's face, though she maintained her composed demeanor. Jonah's shoulders relaxed slightly, while Running Bear's expression remained carefully neutral. They each signed their statements as witnesses, the scratch of pen on paper the only sound in the chamber. With the signed injunctions safely in hand, they stepped back into the late afternoon sun. The air felt lighter somehow, despite the weight of what lay ahead. They still had to return to Eden Spur, still had to see the ruling enforced. Best find lodging for the night, Jonah suggested, looking at the darkening sky. That rain's coming sure as sunrise. They found a modest inn near the courthouse square. The proprietor, a widow named Mrs. Henderson, showed them to simple but clean rooms. Lin May upstairs, Jonah and Running Bear on the ground floor. The rates were fair, and Mrs. Henderson's eyes held no judgment, only practical kindness. In the inn's small parlor, Lin May settled in a chair by the window. She drew out her sewing kit and gestured for Jonah to hand over his coat. "The sleeve is coming loose," she said simply. "It needs mending before we ride back." Jonah hesitated only briefly before shrugging out of the coat. The garment showed signs of hard wear, but Lin May's clever fingers soon had the sleeve secure again. The steady motion of her needle seemed to calm her, as if each stitch helped settle the day's events into proper order. While she worked, Jonah sat at a small writing desk, composing a letter to Rosie. His large hands moved carefully across the paper as he described the judge's ruling and their hopes for justice. Running Bear had gone to check on the horses and scout the town's perimeter, his instincts for danger never truly at rest. Rain began to patter against the windows, softly at first, then with growing intensity. The sound created a cozy atmosphere in the parlor, making their temporary shelter feel more welcoming. Mrs. Henderson brought them coffee and cornbread, her quiet efficiency a comfort. Lin May tied off her last stitch and held up the coat for inspection. "It will hold now," she said with quiet satisfaction. "Sometimes small repairs make all the difference." Jonah looked up from his letter, nodding thanks. "Reckon that's true about more than just coats," he said thoughtfully. "Small things done right can help mend bigger wrongs." The rain continued its steady rhythm on the roof as evening settled in. Running Bear returned, water dripping from his hat brim, reporting all quiet in town. They shared a simple supper in the parlor, each lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. The injunction rested safely in Lin May's satchel, its official seal promising justice. But paper promises required human hearts and hands to make them real. As they retired to their rooms for the night, the rain's gentle percussion reminded them that even the driest ground could be softened, given time and patience. Morning light crept over the horizon, painting the sky in delicate shades of pink and gold. The rain had washed everything clean, leaving behind a world that sparkled with leftover droplets. Jonah stood on the inn's porch, studying the sky with a practiced eye while Running Bear checked the horses. "Looks clear enough?" Jonah said, though his tone held a note of concern. "But that rain's sure to have turned the road to soup." Lin May emerged from the inn, her satchel clutched close. Mrs. Henderson followed with wrapped biscuits for their journey. "Mind you eat these while they're warm," she insisted, pressing the package into Lin May's hands. They set out as the sun cleared the horizon. The wagon wheels immediately sank into the mud, making each mile a test of patience and horseflesh. Running Bear rode ahead as usual, but even his paint horse struggled with the softened ground. "Might take us an extra day," Jonah said, carefully guiding the team around a particularly deep rut. "But better slow than stuck." Lin May nodded, watching the countryside roll past at their reduced pace. The spring landscape looked different after the rain, greener, more hopeful. Wildflowers had begun pushing through the soil, tiny spots of color against the prairie grass. They made less than half their usual distance that day. As the sun began to set, Running Bear found them a sheltered spot near a stand of cottonwoods. The ground there was firmer, with enough dead wood scattered about for a decent fire. Jonah unhitched the horses while Lin May and Running Bear gathered kindling. Soon, a cheerful blaze pushed back the evening chill, casting warm light on their small camp. They shared the last of Mrs. Henderson's biscuits with jerky and coffee, the simple meal tasting better for their hunger. As night settled in properly, Stars began appearing overhead. The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks dancing upward to meet them. It was Running Bear who broke the comfortable silence. "When the spring flows free again," he said thoughtfully, "my people will come to gather medicines that grow there. The old ones remember when all could drink without fear." Lin Mei wrapped her shawl tighter against the evening cool. "I have been thinking about opening a proper mending shop," she said, her voice soft but determined. "Near the spring, perhaps. Where anyone could come, no matter their background." Her fingers absently traced patterns on her satchel. "My uncle always said honest work deserves honest pay." Jonah poked at the fire with a stick, sending up another spray of sparks. "Been too long since I could water my herd without counting every drop or watching for Bell's men." He looked across the flames at his companions. "Reckon there's room enough at that spring for all our dreams." They talked late into the night, sharing hopes that had been kept quiet too long. Running Bear spoke of teaching young ones the old ways of respecting water. Lin Mei described the shop she envisioned, with big windows for proper light and a bench where people could sit and talk while they waited. Jonah talked about expanding his herd, maybe taking on some of the men from the labor camp once they were freed. The next morning dawned clear again, the mud beginning to firm up under the sun's steady gaze. They made better time, though still nothing like their outward journey. It was late afternoon when the familiar silhouette of Eden Spur appeared on the horizon. They could tell something was different even before they reached town. People were gathered on the street in knots of conversation. Reverend Hart stood on the church steps, apparently in the middle of making some announcement. As their wagon rolled down Main Street, faces turned toward them. But instead of the hostile stares they'd half expected, they saw smiles. Word of Judge Ellsworth's ruling had arrived ahead of them by telegraph. Reverend Hart hurried to meet them as they pulled up to the church. Her face was bright with satisfaction. "The whole town's talking about it," she said. "Bell's men were seen pulling down that fence this morning. And look," she pointed to a notice posted on the church door. "We're having a celebration supper tonight. Everyone's bringing something." Inside the church hall, preparations were already underway. Ranch wives arranged tables while Chinese cooks from the railroad camp set up portable stoves. The air filled with a mix of aromas: fresh bread, unfamiliar spices, and roasting meat brought by Shoshone hunters. Lin Mei slipped away to change clothes while Jonah helped move benches. Running Bear spoke quietly with his people, who had brought venison and wild herbs. The atmosphere hummed with an energy that felt new to Eden Spur, cautious but hopeful. As evening approached, lanterns were lit and music began to play. Someone had brought a fiddle, another a guitar. From the railroad camp came the clear notes of a Chinese flute. The melodies wove together, strange at first but gradually finding common ground. People filled their plates with an unusual mix of foods: dumplings beside beef stew, fry bread next to roasted duck. They sat together, trying each other's dishes, asking questions about ingredients and techniques. The conversations were hesitant at first but grew more natural as the evening wore on. Midway through the celebration, Jonah stood up. The hall gradually fell quiet as people noticed him waiting to speak. He cut an imposing figure in his buckskins, but his expression was humble. "Got something needs saying," he announced, his voice carrying to the hall's corners. His eyes found Lin Mei where she sat with some of the Chinese railway workers. "That day at the auction I spoke wrong. Used words that hurt, even though my aim was to help." He squared his shoulders. "My ma taught me better than that. If you're going to tear something, you'd best be ready to mend it proper." The hall was completely silent now. Lin Mei rose slowly from her seat, her face composed but her eyes bright. "So I'm asking before all these witnesses," Jonah continued, "what I can do to mend what I tore." Lin Mei considered him for a long moment. Then a small smile touched her lips. "The bunkhouse men need new coats before winter," she said. "You can start by learning to sew." A ripple of laughter broke the tension. Jonah's weather-worn face creased in an answering smile. "Reckon that's fair," he said. "Though I warn you, my stitches ain't likely to be as neat as yours." "Then you will learn," Lin Mei said firmly, "as we all must learn new ways." The music started up again, livelier than before. People returned to their conversations and their meals, but something had shifted. The barrier between groups felt just a little thinner, a little more permeable. Reverend Hart moved through the crowd, making sure everyone had enough to eat. She paused beside Lin Mei, who was showing Rosie Pike how to properly fold a dumpling. "Reminds me of loaves and fishes," the Reverend said softly, watching the scene before her. "When people share freely, there's always enough to go around." The evening continued, warm with food and fellowship. Children played together in one corner while their parents talked. The Chinese flute player and the fiddler had worked out a tune they could play together. Even Sheriff Cade looked relaxed as he helped himself to a second plate of food. Outside, the spring night was cool and clear. The church windows glowed with lamplight, spilling bright squares onto the street. Inside, people who had been strangers, or worse, enemies, were breaking bread together, finding common ground in shared food and shared hopes for the water that would flow freely again. It wasn't perfect harmony. There were still awkward moments, still places where old habits and prejudices showed through. But it was a beginning, as fragile and precious as the first spring flowers pushing through winter-hardened ground. Running Bear, watching from near the door, summed it up best. "Water knows no boundaries," he said to no one in particular. "It flows where it will, giving life to all who drink. Perhaps people can learn to be like water." The first hint of dawn hadn't yet touched the horizon when Jonah Pike jerked awake, his nose twitching. Smoke. Not wood smoke from a cooking fire, but the acrid bite of burning timber. He rolled from his bedroll in the church vestibule, already reaching for his boots. "Fire!" His shout echoed through the building. "Everyone out!" Orange light flickered through the windows, casting demon shadows on the walls. Heat pressed against the door like a living thing. Jonah burst into the main hall to find flames already crawling up the eastern wall, devouring the dry wood with terrifying speed. "Lin Mei!" he called, charging toward the stairs to the loft. Smoke rolled down from above in thick waves. "Here!" Her voice came from below. She emerged from the back room, clutching her uncle's ledger and the precious map. Relief flooded through him, but there was no time to dwell on it. "Get out," he ordered, pushing her toward the door. "I'll wake the others." Reverend Hart was already up, herding the handful of railway workers who'd been sleeping in the basement. Outside, shouts and running footsteps announced that others had spotted the blaze. The church bell began to toll, its bronze voice calling Eden Spur to action. A bucket line formed quickly, stretching from the town pump to the burning building. Jonah took his place, passing heavy buckets hand to hand. Lin Mei worked beside him, her face set with determination. But the flames were too hungry, too fierce. Water sizzled into steam before it could do more than momentarily darken the burning walls. "The roof's going," someone shouted. Jonah looked up to see flames burst through the shingles, reaching for the pre-dawn sky. The heat drove the bucket line back, forcing them to watch helplessly as the fire devoured the church hall. Lin Mei clutched her satchel containing the ledger and map closer. These documents were their only proof of Bell's schemes, their only leverage against his control of the spring. Jonah saw her eyes widen at something behind him. Before he could turn, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Jonah Pike." Sheriff Cade's boots crunched on the gravel. "You're under arrest." Jonah turned slowly, aware of Lin Mei tensing beside him. The sheriff stood with two deputies, their hands on their gun belts. Behind them, Eustace Bell emerged from the shadows, his usual polished manner somewhat ruffled by the early hour. "What's the charge?" Jonah's voice was level, though his heart hammered. "Theft of property." Cade produced a warrant. "Mr. Bell has sworn out a complaint regarding certain documents taken from his office." "That's a lie." Lin Mei stepped forward, but Jonah caught her arm. Bell's smile was thin and satisfied. "I have here," he said, producing an official-looking paper, "a deportation order for one Lin Mei, also known as Mei Lin, on grounds of theft and violation of labor contracts." The growing crowd murmured. Lin Mei's face went pale, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "These documents belong to my uncle. They prove Dash." She never finished. Running Bear burst through the crowd, his usually composed face tight with urgency. "The spring," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its quietness. "Someone has poisoned it." "What?" Several voices spoke at once. "Creosote," Running Bear said grimly. "Poured into the water box. The whole flow is tainted. He paused, and his next words fell like stones into silence. Young Tommy Finch drank from the barrel this morning. He's very ill. A woman's cry rose from the crowd. Tommy's aunt, who had taken him in after his parents' death. The boy had been looking peaky lately, everyone knew, and bad water could kill a weak child. Lies, Belle said smoothly. The spring is perfectly safe. This is clearly an attempt to— My deputies confirmed it. Running Bear cut in. The smell of creosote is strong. The water runs black. Confusion erupted. People shouted questions, accusations. Behind them, the church hall's roof collapsed with a tremendous crash, sending sparks spiraling into the lightening sky. In the chaos, Sheriff Cade moved. Hands behind your back, Pike, he ordered, producing handcuffs. Jonah considered fighting. He could see Lin May's satchel with their precious evidence, could almost reach it. But Belle's men had moved to surround them, and any resistance would only make things worse. It'll be all right, he said to Lin May, though his gut twisted at the lie. He submitted to the cuffs. Belle gestured to his men. Take Miss Lin to the freight office. She'll be held there until the next train east. No! Lin May clutched her satchel tighter, but two men grabbed her arms. The ledger and map fell to the ground. Before anyone could move, one of Belle's men scooped them up and tossed them into the burning church. That's destruction of evidence, Reverend Hart's voice rang out, but Belle only smiled. What evidence? Those were stolen documents now destroyed by an unfortunate fire. A fire that, I might add, started in a building where Mr. Pike was sleeping. Interesting coincidence, wouldn't you say, Sheriff? Cade's face showed a flicker of discomfort, but he said nothing. He led Jonah away toward the jail, ignoring the protests of those who had supported them. Lin May fought as Belle's men dragged her toward the freight office, but she was no match for their strength. Running Bear started forward, but more of Belle's men moved to block his path, hands on their guns. Don't, Jonah called to him. We need you free. The sun finally crested the horizon, painting the scene in a harsh light. Smoke from the dying church fire drifted through town like a shroud. People stood in small groups, whispering, watching as their hopes for justice crumbled. By mid-morning, word spread that Tommy Finch's condition was worsening. The doctor had been summoned, but the boy's fever was dangerously high. Without clean water, there was little hope for his recovery. Jonah paced his cell, 8 steps one way, 8 steps back. Through the barred window, he could see people hurrying past with covered buckets, seeking water from wherever they could find it. The town's wells had been going dry for months. That was why control of the spring was so crucial. Around noon, Reverend Hart appeared at his cell. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes red from smoke and tears. They've got Lin May locked in the freight office, she reported in a low voice. 2 guards on the door. Belle's men are watching Running Bear's every move. She gripped the bars. Jonah, what are we going to do? We've still got the truth, he said, though his voice was heavy. And there are copies of those ledger entries, the ones Lin May made. The Reverend's face fell further. The copies were in my desk, in the church hall. Jonah closed his eyes briefly. Of course. Everything they had worked for, every piece of evidence they had gathered, gone up in flames that somehow started exactly where they needed to start. Throughout the afternoon, more news filtered in through sympathetic visitors. The spring water was completely unusable, contaminated all the way down to the holding tanks. Belle was charging double prices for water from his private reservoir, water he had diverted and stored before poisoning the spring. Those who couldn't pay were going thirsty. Evening brought cooler air, but no relief. Jonah could hear raised voices from the direction of the freight office, Lin May's guards laughing, their crude jokes carrying on the wind. He clenched his fists, knowing she could hear them too. Sheriff Cade appeared as darkness fell, looking troubled. He checked Jonah's cell door, then stood for a moment, jingling his keys. You're making a mistake, Hollis, Jonah said quietly. Maybe. Cade's voice was equally low. But I've got a town to keep peaceful. Belle owns half the businesses here now, fighting him. He shook his head. And when Tommy Finch dies? When others get sick, that'll be peaceful? Cade didn't answer. He walked away, his boot heels clicking on the wooden floor. Night settled over Eden Spur like a smothering blanket, The usual evening sounds, piano music from the saloon, voices from the street, were muted, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Fear had taken root, spreading like poison through a water table. From his cell, Jonah could see the ruins of the church hall silhouetted against the stars. The walls still stood, blackened sentinels marking their failure. Somewhere in that wreckage lay the ashes of their evidence. Somewhere across town, Lin Mei waited in darkness for a train that would take her far from everything she had built here. And in a small house on the edge of town, a young boy fought for his life, his fever fed by tainted water. Jonah leaned his forehead against the cool iron bars. They had tried to do things properly, legally. They had won their case fairly. And still, they had lost. To fire, to poison, to the crushing weight of money and power used without conscience. But the night wasn't over yet, and Jonah Pike had not survived years in the mountains by giving up when things looked darkest. Moonlight filtered through the barred window of Jonah's cell, casting shadows that stretched like iron fingers across the floor. The jail's night lamp burned low, its yellow glow barely reaching the corners. Reverend Hart's footsteps echoed in the quiet as she approached his cell for the second time that day. "Your fists are clenched so tight I can hear the leather of your gloves creaking," she said softly. Jonah didn't relax his hands. "Tommy Finch is dying. Lin Mei is locked up like property. And Bell's men are strutting around town like they own it. Which they legally do, at least until we can prove otherwise." The Reverend's voice remained calm, though her eyes showed her own anger. "But violence won't help us now, Jonah. It'll only give Bell more ammunition. Sometimes a man has to stand up. And sometimes," she cut in firmly, "a man has to stay standing without throwing a punch. That takes more strength than fighting." Jonah turned to look at her fully. The lamplight caught the silver in her hair, reminding him of how many years she had spent serving this community, how many battles she had fought with words and wisdom instead of fists. "What would you have me do?" he asked, his voice rough with frustration. "Trust in the truth," she said. "Trust in Lin Mei's strength. Trust in God's timing." She reached through the bars to touch his arm. "And trust in those of us still working outside these walls." Across town, in the stifling confines of the freight office, Lin Mei sat at a small desk, her face illuminated by a single lamp. One of Bell's men had brought it earlier, along with paper and ink, not out of kindness but because Bell wanted her occupied while they waited for the eastbound train. "Keep her quiet," he had ordered. "Let her play with her little drawings." But Lin Mei wasn't drawing. Her hand moved steadily across the paper, recreating her uncle's ledger from memory. Each Chinese character was carefully formed, each English translation precise. Column after column of numbers emerged, telling their story of theft and exploitation. She had spent months studying those pages, checking and double-checking the discrepancies. Now, as she wrote, she could see them clearly in her mind. Dates, amounts, names. The truth, preserved not in paper and ink, but in her determination to honor her uncle's sacrifice. A knock at the door made her pause. One of the guards opened it to reveal Rosie Pike, carrying a covered basket. "Brought some supper," Rosie said briskly. "Can't have her fainting on the train tomorrow? Wouldn't look good." The guards exchanged glances, then shrugged. They had seen Rosie around town, knew she was respectable. "Make it quick," one said. Rosie set the basket on the desk beside Lin Mei. As she lifted out bread and cheese, her hand brushed against Lin Mei's arm. Something slipped from her sleeve, more paper, a fresh bottle of ink. "Eat slow," Rosie murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "The bread's heavy. Needs time to settle." Lin Mei understood. She nibbled at the food, making it last while her other hand continued writing. Rosie stayed a few minutes, talking loudly about nothing important, her body blocking the guard's view of the desk. When she left, Lin Mei had enough supplies to work through the night. She dipped her pen and continued, each stroke a quiet act of defiance. Miles away, Running Bear moved like a shadow through the gathering darkness. The spring lay ahead, its water now running black with poison. He counted 4 men with rifles patrolling the fence line more than usual. They carried lanterns, their light creating pools of visibility that he carefully avoided. From his hidden vantage point, he could see the diverted stream flowing into Bell's private reservoir. The water there was clear. They had poisoned the spring after filling their own tanks. His people had been right to mistrust promises made by men like Bell. The guards' conversation carried on the night air. They spoke of the boy, Tommy Finch, making crude jokes about his suffering. Running Bear's hand tightened on his knife, but he held still. Violence now would only make things worse. Back at the freight office, the guards had been drinking steadily since sunset. Their voices grew louder, their words more crude with each passing hour. "Hey, China girl," one called through the window. "Better eat up while you can. Long ride east tomorrow." "Yeah," another chimed in. "Though with all that extra weight, maybe you should walk instead. Save the railroad some strain." Coarse laughter followed. Lin May kept her head down, pen moving steadily across the paper. Another voice joined in, slurring badly. "What's she writing anyway? Probably love letters to Pike. Bet that's why he bought her. Always did have strange tastes." More laughter, more insults about her size, her heritage, her worth as a person. Lin May's hand trembled slightly, but she didn't stop writing. Each character was a shield against their words. Each line of figures a reminder of why she was here. She thought of her uncle, of his quiet dignity in the face of similar taunts. He had taught her that education was armor, that knowledge could not be taken away by cruel words or cruel men. So she wrote, letting their mockery wash over her like muddy water, leaving no stain. In his cell, Jonah lay on the hard bunk, every muscle tense. He could hear distant voices from the direction of the freight office, could imagine what Lin May was enduring. His fists clenched and unclenched in the darkness. The Reverend's words echoed in his mind. Trust in Lin May's strength. He had seen that strength, hidden beneath her quiet manner. Had watched her face Bell without flinching, had seen her stand tall, despite the townspeople's initial scorn. But knowing she was strong didn't make it easier to lie here, unable to help. The cell walls seemed to close in with each passing hour, with each thought of what might be happening across town. A guard passed by, boots clicking on the wooden floor. Through the window, Jonah could see the moon riding high, its light touching the burned-out shell of the church hall. Somewhere in those ruins lay the ashes of their evidence. But the truth wasn't lost. It lived in Lin May's memory, was being reborn through her careful writing. The night crept forward, marked by the guards' regular patrols and the distant sound of the freight office door opening and closing as shifts changed. Jonah didn't sleep. He lay still, listening, thinking of Lin May bent over her work, of Running Bear watching the spring, of all the threads of trust and truth that bound them together. In the freight office, Lin May's pen continued its steady movement, page after page filled with figures, dates, names. Her hand ached, but she didn't stop. The guards' voices had finally quieted as exhaustion and drink took their toll. She paused only to flex her cramped fingers, looking at what she had accomplished. Not just numbers on paper, but proof. Proof of theft, of exploitation, of human beings treated like commodities. Proof that could not be burned or buried or forgotten. The lamp flickered, running low on oil. Lin May touched the fresh paper Rosie had brought, grateful for the kindness it represented. She thought of Jonah in his cell, of Running Bear watching the spring, of Reverend Hart and Rosie and all the others who had chosen to stand with her. Their support gave her strength, but this task was hers alone. So she straightened her back, dipped her pen once more, and continued writing. The truth would survive this night, preserved one careful character at a time. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly overhead. Eden Spur lay quiet, its streets empty save for Bell's men making their rounds. But within the jail and the freight office, in the shadows around the spring, resistance lived, not in violence or loud protest, but in steady hands and watchful eyes, in trust and truth and quiet defiance. The night was long, but Lin May's determination was longer. She wrote on, each stroke of her pen a promise that justice would not be silenced. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of pearl and gold, casting long shadows across Eden Spur's empty streets. At the burned remains of the church hall, Running Bear stood quietly, watching smoke still rise from patches of smoldering wood. The acrid scent of destroyed hopes hung heavy in the morning air. He lifted a carved wooden staff, its surface marked with symbols of water, earth, and unity. The morning light caught the deep grooves of each careful marking. This staff had been passed down through generations of his people, used to call gatherings in times of great need. Now it would serve again. Running Bear planted his feet firmly and began a low, resonant chant. The sound carried across the quiet town, drawing people from their homes and businesses. First came the Shoshone elders, their faces grave as they took in the destruction. Then ranchers appeared, many still wearing work clothes from early morning chores. Townspeople drifted in by twos and threes, keeping careful distance from each other at first. Reverend Hart arrived, her church shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill. She nodded to Running Bear, understanding passing between them. More people gathered, storekeepers, railroad workers who hadn't yet been sent away, mothers with children clinging to their skirts. Even those who usually kept their distance from such meetings found themselves drawn to the charred steps. When the crowd had grown substantial, Running Bear raised the staff high. In one fluid motion, he drove it deep into the ashes at his feet. The sound of wood meeting earth rang out like a bell. "We will be seen," he declared, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered faces. "The water flows for all, or it flows for none. This was the promise made to my people, and this promise has been broken." He gestured to the burned building behind him. "They think fire can destroy truth. They think poison can kill justice. But we are like the spring itself. We rise from the earth. We find our way through stone. We cannot be stopped by fences or fear." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably, but none left. Running Bear continued, his words measured and clear. "We do not call for violence, we call for sight, for all to see what has been hidden. Tomorrow, we will gather here again. We will stand together, Shoshone, settler, townsperson, worker. We will be seen." Reverend Hart stepped forward then, her voice strong despite the grief evident in her face. "Friends and neighbors," she began. "I have walked these streets for 15 years, sharing God's word about mercy and justice. Today I ask you, what mercy is there in poisoned water? What justice in stolen wages?" She moved among the crowd as she spoke, meeting eyes, touching shoulders. "Our Lord Jesus taught us to care for the least among us, to stand with those who suffer wrong. He did not tell us to count their worth in dollars or judge them by their appearance." The Reverend's words seemed to loosen something in the crowd. People began to whisper together, to nod, to reach across old divisions. Rosie Pike, who had been standing near the back, suddenly strode forward. "The children," she announced clearly. "Let the children speak truth too." She turned to the cluster of her students who had followed their parents to the gathering. "Who wants to help make banners?" Hands shot up immediately. Children loved any chance to paint, and these children had watched the events of recent days with keen eyes. They understood more than adults sometimes credited. "We'll need cloth," Rosie continued, her teacher's voice taking charge. "And paint. Mrs. Henderson, might we use your shop's back room?" The seamstress nodded quickly. "I have remnants that would serve well." Others began offering supplies. Paint from the hardware store, brushes from the sign painter's shop. Rosie organized the children into groups, assigning tasks with practiced efficiency. "What should we write?" she asked her students. "Water," called out Tommy Finch's sister, her young face fierce with worry for her sick brother. "Mercy," suggested another child, clearly echoing Reverend Hart's words. "Wages," came a third voice, this from a railway worker's son who had watched his father count coins too carefully for too long. Rosie nodded approval at each suggestion. "Yes, all of those." Truth painted large, so none can ignore it. The meeting transformed into purposeful activity. People who had stood apart now worked together, planning the next day's assembly. The Shoshone elders consulted with ranchers about where to position people. Townswomen discussed bringing food and water, clean water from wells far from the poisoned spring. Through it all, Running Bear's staff stood straight in the ashes, a symbol of determination that could not be burned away. Across town in the freight office, Lynn May's pen made its final stroke. She sat back, flexing cramped fingers, and surveyed her work. Through the long night, she had recreated every entry from her uncle's ledger. Dates, names, amounts both promised and paid. The evidence lived again. Carefully, she folded the papers into a thin packet. Using needle and thread she had kept hidden in her sleeve, she opened a seam in her dress lining. The packet slipped inside perfectly, invisible unless you knew where to look. She restitched the seam with tiny, precise stitches. The guards had changed shifts at dawn. These new ones were sober at least, though no kinder. They didn't notice her careful sewing. Women were always mending something, after all. They were more interested in the gathering they could see through the window. "Trouble brewing," one muttered to his partner. "Let 'em try something," the other replied, patting his gun. "Boss'll sort 'em out quick enough." Lin Mei kept her head down, hiding a small smile. Let them think her beaten. Let them believe the evidence was lost. Truth had a way of surviving, like water finding its path through stone. In his jail cell, Jonah lay still on his bunk, listening. The voices from outside carried clearly through his window. Running Bear's steady declarations, Reverend Hart's passionate words, the excited chatter of children planning their banners. Each sound lit a spark of hope in his chest. He remembered other gatherings he'd seen, where anger led to violence and nothing was solved. But this felt different. This was not rage but resolve, not revenge but resurrection. They were choosing to stand together, to be seen, to let truth speak louder than force. The guard walking past his cell paused, cocking his head to listen as well. Jonah watched the man's face change as he recognized voices, neighbors, friends, maybe even family members out there joining the gathering. More voices joined the chorus outside, the blacksmith offering his shop as a meeting point, the telegraph operator volunteering to send messages to newspapers in larger towns, the doctor insisting on checking on Tommy Finch before anything else happened. Jonah sat up slowly, hope growing stronger with each new voice. They had tried to break things apart, burn evidence, arrest leaders, turn neighbor against neighbor. Instead, they had created the very unity they feared. Through his window, he could just see the top of the staff Running Bear had planted. It stood straight and proud against the morning sky, like truth itself rising from ashes. The voices outside grew stronger, more purposeful. Plans were being made, tasks assigned, bridges built between people who had barely spoken before. Tomorrow they would gather again, not in secret but in full sight of all. Jonah closed his eyes, feeling the spark of hope grow brighter. They had chosen the harder path, not violence but visibility, not revenge but restoration. Whatever came tomorrow, they would face it together. The sun climbed higher, its light touching the charred steps where Running Bear's staff stood sentinel. Around it, the people of Eden Spur continued their preparations, weaving themselves into something stronger than they had been before, something that could not be broken by force or fear. Truth would be seen, justice would be served, and they would face it standing side by side. The morning sun crept over Eden Spur's rooftops, catching the fresh paint on dozens of banners that fluttered in the cool spring breeze. Children's careful letters proclaimed mercy and water and justice in bright colors against white cloth. The banners transformed Main Street into something both solemn and hopeful, like a church dressed for celebration. People emerged from their homes and shops, gathering in twos and threes until the street filled with a quiet crowd. Chinese workers stood shoulder to shoulder with ranch hands. Shoshone families mixed with townspeople. Even those who usually kept their distance found themselves drawn together, sharing worried glances and whispered conversations. At precisely 8 o'clock, Reverend Abigail Hart stepped onto the church's scorched steps. In her hands, she held a small brass bell, the only thing salvaged from the fire. Its ring might have seemed thin and lonely compared to the church's great bell, now melted to slag, but somehow its clear voice carried even more weight. Ding, ding, ding. The crowd fell silent, faces turning toward the sound. Reverend Hart's voice carried clearly in the hush. Friends, neighbors, children of God, we gather today to speak truth and seek justice, to stand together against those who would divide us. She paused, surveying the crowd with eyes that held both steel and kindness. Miss Rosie Pike and her students will lead us in bearing witness. Rosie stepped forward, her usual brisk manner softened by the gravity of the moment. Behind her came 24 children, each carrying a painted banner. They moved with the careful dignity of those who know they're part of something important. Tommy Finch should be here with us, Rosie said clearly. naming the boy still sick from the poisoned spring. In his place, his sister Sarah will speak first. A small girl stepped forward, clutching her banner. Her voice trembled but grew stronger as she spoke. My brother just wanted a drink of water. Water should be free. Water should be clean. Water should be for everyone. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. More children stepped forward, each with their own brief testimony about what they had seen and heard in recent days. Their simple words carried a power that made even the most hardened listeners shift uncomfortably. The sound of boots on wooden planks drew all eyes to the freight office. Sheriff Cade emerged, leading Lin May. Her hands were bound, but she walked with quiet dignity, her head high. The crowd parted to let them pass. Someone had positioned a wagon near the church steps. Cade helped Lin May climb onto it, though his movement suggested reluctance rather than courtesy. She stood straight despite her bonds, her voice clear and steady as she began to speak. My uncle Chen Wei came to America believing in opportunity. He learned English, became a railroad tallyman, kept honest books. Lin May's eyes swept the crowd. When he discovered others keeping dishonest books, he did not stay silent. 3 days later, there was a mine collapse. Only his body was recovered. A sympathetic murmur ran through the crowd. Lin May continued, her voice growing stronger. Before he died, my uncle gave me his ledger and a map. He told me about a spring, and a promise made that its water would flow freely if labor remained free. Both promises have been broken. She described the wage fraud in detail, how much was promised, how much was actually paid, how workers were kept in debt. Her words painted a picture of systematic theft that made people shake their heads in growing anger. But stealing wages was not enough, she went on. When we sought justice through law, they burned our evidence. When that did not silence us, they poisoned the spring itself. Running Bear stepped forward then, his presence commanding immediate attention. He spoke of the treaty that had been made concerning the spring, of promises given and received, of the sacred nature of water itself. Water gives life, he said simply. To poison water is to poison life itself. My people have watched this spring flow for generations. We shared it freely, asking only that others do the same. Now we watch it run dark with poison while men with guns keep people thirsty. A ranch wife pushed forward, Mrs. Henderson, whose farm lay downstream from the spring. Her face was red with anger and grief as she spoke. 3 of my calves died yesterday, she declared. Good stock, healthy until they drank from the creek below the spring. My children could have drunk that water. Any of our children could have. More people began speaking up. Parents worried about water. Workers describing wages stolen. Farmers telling of dried-up creeks where the spring's flow once ran. Each testimony built on the ones before, creating a picture of widespread harm that could no longer be ignored. The crowd's attention shifted as another group approached, 2 deputies leading Jonah Pike, his hands chained. His buckskins were dusty from his cell, but his back was straight as he walked. The deputies brought him to the wagon where Lin May stood. Without being prompted, Jonah went to his knees in the dirt. The crowd grew absolutely silent, watching. Miss Lin, he said, his voice rough but clear. That day at the auction I spoke wrongly. I meant to help, but I caused hurt instead. I own those words now, and I ask your pardon for them. Lin May looked down at him for a long moment. You spoke in haste, she said finally, but you acted with honor. The words are past. Let us look to what comes next. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Something shifted in the atmosphere, a sense of barriers breaking down, of new understanding taking root. People who had watched Lin May's testimony with uncertainty now nodded in support. Those who had doubted Jonah's motives saw them clearly at last. Reverend Hart stepped forward again, the small bell in her hands catching the morning light. She didn't ring it this time, just held it up for all to see. This bell survived the fire, she said. Like truth, it cannot be destroyed. It will ring again, calling us all to remember this day, when we chose to stand together, when we chose to speak truth, when we chose justice over fear. The crowd had grown larger as she spoke. More townspeople arrived, drawn by the gathering. Among them were faces that had been missing before, Business owners who had stayed neutral, ranchers who had kept their distance. Now they joined the assembly, standing shoulder to shoulder with their neighbors. Someone started singing, an old hymn about justice rolling down like waters. Others joined in, voices rising in harmony. The painted banners rippled in the breeze, their messages clear against the morning sky. Mercy, water, justice, truth. Lin Mei remained standing on the wagon, her bound hands folded calmly before her. But her eyes were bright as she watched the scene below, children holding their banners high, Running Bear standing tall beside the charred church steps, Jonah still kneeling in the dust, and all around them, a community finding its voice at last. The morning sun climbed higher, glinting off windows and weather vanes, touching each face in the crowd. Its light revealed what had always been true but had needed this moment to become clear, that they were stronger together than apart, that justice was worth standing for, that truth would find its way to the surface like water through stone. Eustace Bell burst from his office door, his normally polished appearance disheveled. His vest hung open, and sweat darkened the collar of his white shirt. The morning sun caught the brass buttons of his coat as he stormed down the wooden sidewalk toward the gathered crowd. "This is an illegal assembly," Bell's voice cracked as he shouted over the crowd. His face had turned an alarming shade of red. "You're interfering with legitimate business operations." The assembled townspeople drew closer together, but no one stepped back. Painted banners continued to wave in the morning breeze. Mercy, water, wages. The children holding them stood their ground, though some shifted nervously at Bell's angry approach. Samuel Whitehorse, one of the tribal elders who had been standing near Running Bear, stepped forward. His weathered face was calm as he turned to Sheriff Cade, who still stood near the wagon where Lin Mei remained. "Lawman," Samuel said, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden quiet, "you wear that star to protect all people, not just those with money. The time has come to choose your side." Other elders moved to stand with Samuel. Martha Two Rivers, her gray hair bound in traditional braids, fixed Cade with a stern look. "Will you defend those who poison water and steal wages, or will you stand with those who seek justice?" Sheriff Cade's hand moved uncertainly to his badge. The silver star caught the light as his fingers touched it. His weather-lined face showed the struggle within as he looked from the elders to Bell, then to the assembled crowd. Bell's composure cracked entirely. With a snarl, he spun and lunged for a rifle leaning against his office wall. The wooden stock slapped into his hands as he grabbed it, and several people gasped as he swung the barrel toward the crowd. But Jonah Pike was faster. Despite his chained hands, he surged to his feet and stepped between Bell and the townspeople. His broad shoulders were straight, his stance steady as he faced the rifle's muzzle without flinching. "You would shoot unarmed folk?" Jonah's voice was quiet but carried clearly. "Women? Children? That what you come to, Bell?" Running Bear moved like flowing water, swift and smooth. His hand closed over the rifle barrel, pushing it toward the ground. His dark eyes met Bell's wild ones with unwavering calm. "We will not trade theft for blood," Running Bear said firmly. "Your path ends here, but it need not end in violence." Something broke in Bell's expression. The rifle slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the wooden sidewalk. Running Bear kicked it well away from everyone, the sound of it spinning across the planks oddly loud in the tense silence. Sheriff Cade straightened his shoulders. The uncertainty left his face as he finally made his choice. With deliberate steps, he crossed to where Bell stood trembling with rage. "Eustace Bell," Cade's voice was formal, carrying the weight of law. "You're under arrest for attempted assault with a deadly weapon, criminal conspiracy, and destruction of evidence." He pulled his handcuffs free and reached for Bell's wrists. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The click of the handcuffs closing seemed to break some spell. The crowd let out a collective breath. Several people began to applaud, but Reverend Hart raised her hands for quiet. "Young Jim Carter," she called out, "you're the fastest rider here. Take your bay mare and ride for the county seat. Tell Judge Ellsworth what's happened, all of it, mind you. The assault, the poisoned spring, everything." Jim, a lanky youth of 16, was already running for the livery stable. "Yes, ma'am," he called back over his shoulder. "I'll ride like the wind." The sound of hoofbeats soon echoed down the street as Jim galloped his mare east, toward the county seat and justice. But the immediate crisis had passed. leaving them with the fouled spring still to deal with. Martha Two Rivers approached Lin May's wagon, her face gentle. "Child, let me see your hands." When Lin May held out her bound wrists, Martha turned to Sheriff Cade. "The key, lawman. These bonds were never right." Cade hesitated only a moment before tossing her his key ring. Martha's aged fingers were still nimble as she unlocked the cuffs. She did the same for Jonah, patting his arm motherly as she freed him. "Thank you, grandmother," Jonah said softly, rubbing his wrists. The crowd began to settle in for a long wait. Women brought food from nearby homes, bread and cheese, apples and dried meat. Children were organized into shifts, so the banners would stay aloft, but no one would tire too quickly. Rosie Pike set up a table with water brought from clean wells outside town, making sure everyone stayed hydrated in the growing heat of the day. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent toward afternoon. Still, the people held their ground. They shared stories, sang songs, and watched over each other. When someone grew tired, another would step up to take their place. Bell sat in the jail cell that had held Jonah, his face a mask of impotent fury. Two deputies guarded him, looking uncomfortable in the role reversal. Sheriff Cade moved through the crowd, speaking quietly with different groups as if seeing his townspeople clearly for the first time. Running Bear and several other Shoshone men kept watch on the spring, making sure no one interfered further with the water source. They reported that the fouled water was still flowing, carrying its poison downstream. It would take time for the contamination to clear. As shadows began to lengthen across Main Street, Lin May opened her small sewing kit. She began mending torn sleeves and loose buttons for anyone who needed it, her needle flashing in the late afternoon light. Others joined her, sharing thread and patches, turning the wait into a time of community care. Jonah moved through the crowd too, his presence steady and reassuring. He helped shift heavy water barrels, lifted tired children for better views, and spoke quietly with those who seemed anxious. The memory of him standing unarmed before Bell's rifle had transformed him in the town's eyes. No longer just the gruff mountain man, but someone who would risk his life to protect others. The painted banners continued to wave as dusk approached, their messages just as clear in the fading light. Mercy, water, wages. The spring remained fouled, but hope had taken root in its place. Hope born of courage, unity, and the power of standing together against injustice. Samuel Whitehorse gathered some of the younger children around him, teaching them a Shoshone song about water, about how it flows, how it gives life, how it cannot be truly owned. Their young voices carried the ancient melody into the evening air, a reminder of the spring's deeper meaning. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Still, the people held their ground, waiting for word from the county seat, watching over their poisoned spring, standing together as shadows lengthened across Main Street. Reverend Hart moved among them with lanterns as true darkness approached, helping set up light for the night watch. The banners remained aloft, their messages now illuminated by flickering flames. Mercy, water, wages. The spring still ran fouled, but the people who depended on it had found their strength, in unity, in peaceful resistance, and in the courage to stand together for what was right. Dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds as a determined group made their way to the spring. Jonah Pike led the way, followed by Running Bear, Lin May, and several townspeople carrying tools. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and damp earth. "This fence ain't got no right to be here," Jonah declared, gripping the wire cutters. The barbed wire snapped with sharp metallic pings as he and Running Bear worked their way down the line. Others pulled up the posts, their boots finding firm purchase in the softening ground. At the water box, they found the wooden structure still reeking of creosote. Working together, they dismantled the contaminated boards and cleared the channel. Fresh water bubbled up from the earth, at first running dark but gradually clearing as they flushed the poison away. Tommy Finch stood nearby, his face still pale but eager. When Running Bear tested the water and nodded, the boy cupped his hands and drank. Though he coughed a little, his breathing was easier than it had been in days. Reverend Hart gathered everyone in a circle around the spring. "Dear Lord," she began, her voice carrying on the morning breeze, "we thank you for this water, freely given, now freely shared again." As the sun climbed higher, A stagecoach rattled into town. The driver carried a telegram from Judge Ellsworth. Lin May's hands trembled as she read the paper aloud. The injunction would stand. Bell would face fraud charges and all labor auctions were declared void. "It's really over," she whispered, clutching the telegram to her chest. Relief softened her features as she looked at Jonah, now officially a free man. That evening they gathered around Rosie Pike's table. The meal was simple: bread, stew, and fresh water from the spring. But it tasted like victory. For the first time in weeks, they ate without looking over their shoulders, without fear darkening their doors. The weeks that followed brought new life to Eden Spur. Each morning, the sound of hammers and saws rang out as townspeople worked to rebuild the church hall. Running Bear's fellow Shoshone craftsmen carved intricate patterns into the wooden lintels above the doors, their tools creating flowing designs of water and life. "These marks tell the story of shared blessings," Running Bear explained, running his hand over the fresh carved wood. "Like the spring, they remind us what can flow between people." Near the town square, men and women took turns digging a new communal well. The work was hard, but spirits stayed high. Even the children helped, carrying water and snacks to the workers. In a sun-filled storefront, Lin May and Rosie arranged their new seamstress shop. Neat rows of thread in every color lined the walls, and 2 sturdy work tables stood ready for mending. Lin May hung a simple sign in both English and Chinese characters: Pike and Lin Mending. Jonah surprised everyone with his dedication to learning the treadle sewing machine. His large hands, once more familiar with rope and reins, now guided fabric through the needle with growing confidence. Each evening he could be found in the kitchen stirring thick stews that filled the air with savory aromas. Running Bear became a regular visitor, bringing supple hides that needed repair. "Good stitching makes things last," he said, watching Jonah work, like good promises kept. Outside the shop windows, children played freely in the street, their laughter mixing with the sounds of work and conversation. The tight-shouldered wariness that had gripped Eden Spur began to soften, like ice melting in spring sunshine. Where suspicion once drew hard lines between people, new bonds of trust grew stronger with each passing day. The evening air carried a crisp bite as Jonah reached into his vest pocket. The brass kerosene lamp cast warm shadows across the shop's wooden walls as he withdrew a single coin. It caught the light, gleaming dully, the same dollar that had changed everything that day at the auction. With careful movements, he placed it on the shop's stone mantel. "Reckon this needs a proper place," he said, his voice low, "to remind me how words can wound folks, and how grace can mend what's broken." Lin May crossed the room, her skirts rustling softly. She studied the coin, turning it over in her palm. Without a word, she walked to the church, offering tin by the door, and dropped it in with a clear ring. "Let it fetch more water," she said simply, a small smile touching her lips. Through the window, lanterns dotted Main Street like earthbound stars. The steady rhythm of hammers echoed from the church hall, where workers finished the last sections of the new roof. Running Bear arrived as Jonah ladled out bowls of fragrant stew. Over supper, he shared plans for protecting the spring. "We will watch in shifts," he explained. "All people together. This is how we keep promises strong." Weeks passed, and spring settled fully over Eden Spur. The morning sun warmed the gathering crowd at the sacred spring, where 3 cultures came together in celebration. Chinese dumplings steamed beside Shoshone flatbread and settler pies on checkered blankets spread across the grass. Reverend Hart stood at the water's edge, her gray hair crowned with morning light. "This water flows for all," she proclaimed, sprinkling drops in blessing. "May it remind us always that we are one community." Above them, a banner sewn with careful stitches billowed in the breeze. "We belong." Children darted beneath it, their laughter mixing with splashing water. Their small faces, Chinese, Shoshone, settler, shone with equal joy as they played together. Near the food tables, Rosie and Lin May shared a moment of mirth over a tangled thread in their latest project. Jonah watched them from his place by the spring, quiet pride softening his weathered features. The sight of Lin May standing tall, respected, and at home made his heart full. Running Bear observed from the shade of a cottonwood, satisfaction in his dark eyes. The old promise lived again in these moments of unity. As the sun began its westward journey, its fire-orange light danced on the spring's surface. Eden Spur felt whole again, its wounds healed by shared water and mercy. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.